You sent us this specific Times of India report because, well, you were tired of the disjointed headlines. And looking through the notes you attached, you're absolutely right to focus on the subtext here. Because you log on, right, and you see this relentless barrage of updates. Names of world leaders, mentions of ballistic trajectories, drones.
Conflicting declarations of total victory.
Exactly. And looming threats of structural economic collapse. It becomes a blur of geopolitical noise.
It really does.
So let's pull apart this dossier you've handed us. Today, our objective is to cut straight through that noise. We are taking this incredibly dense piece of source material and examining the architecture beneath it. We're looking at excerpts detailing a rapidly escalating, a multi-theater military confrontation.
And we are talking about the United States, Iran, Israel, Russia, and China.
Yeah, 4 major global powers and key regional players all colliding in one highly volatile arena.
It is an intricate web, and the feeling of disorientation that you noted in your request, it's entirely by design. Because modern conflicts of this scale aren't merely kinetic. They are fought relentlessly in the cognitive and informational domains.
Absolutely. So our goal for this deep dive is to look past the immediate explosions.
Right, the physical reality of the battlefield.
Right, and focus on the strategic chess match happening in the background. We're going to decode the diplomatic posturing, the macroeconomic warfare, and the underlying anxiety that the source material lays bare.
We need to examine how these nations are utilizing back-channel communications, or in some pivotal instances, how they're deliberately talking right past each other to address completely different audiences.
But before we get into the granular details of your notes, we really need to establish a very clear framework for this analysis.
Yes, that is crucial.
The source material we are working with today contains heavily conflicting viewpoints, blatant contradictions, and highly politically charged rhetoric from multiple nations.
You're going to hear absolute claims of victory from one side and declarations of total adversary failure from the other.
Right. So we want to state explicitly right here at the top, we are not taking sides.
We are not endorsing any nation's claims, nor are we validating the political or military rhetoric presented in the text.
Exactly. Our function is strictly to report on these perspectives objectively, to unpack the mechanics of what the source material is communicating.
And to understand the real politics strategies driving these statements. We are looking at the how and the why of the statecraft, not adjudicating the truth of the kinetic battlefield claims.
Right. That's a fundamental distinction.
It is. In a geopolitical crisis of this magnitude, the statements issued by foreign ministries are just as weaponized as the hardware deployed in the region. By analyzing the rhetoric impartially, we can expose the hidden leverage points and the structural vulnerabilities of the nations involved.
Yeah, the text you provided really offers an unprecedented window into how modern hegemony is contested simultaneously on military, monetary, and informational fronts.
Let's start with the immediate kinetic reality the text paints right at the beginning.
Okay, let's unpack this. It describes a severe confrontation between Iran and the United States, with Washington preparing to intensify its military campaign alongside Israel.
And Tehran defiantly refusing to absorb the pressure.
Right. The text vividly outlines missiles in the air and drones operating across the theater.
This is a very chaotic scene.
It does. But then the narrative introduces this sudden diplomatic pivot. Global powers are circling the immediate combat zone, and Moscow steps in to introduce a completely new dimension to the crisis.
Yes, the Russian intervention.
According to the report, Russia states it is ready to help de-escalate the conflict, and the Kremlin announced that President Vladimir Putin formally offered options to mediate during a direct phone call with U.S. President Donald Trump.
The concept of dual-track diplomacy here requires serious examination, especially given Russia's current macroeconomic and geopolitical positioning.
Because there's a huge paradox here, right?
A striking paradox. On one hand, the report explicitly notes that Russia maintains a strategic partnership with Iran and has formally condemned the military campaign launched by the United States and Israel.
So publicly and strategically, Moscow is tethered to Tehran.
Exactly. Yet simultaneously, Vladimir Putin is initiating direct contact with Washington, offering to play the impartial peacemaker and present actionable frameworks aimed at quickly ending the conflict.
But is that actually sustainable? I mean, you condemn a U.S. military campaign on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday, you're on the line with the U.S. president proposing a roadmap for de-escalation.
It is a very tightrope to walk.
By trying to play the benevolent mediator with Washington while holding Iran's hand, doesn't Putin risk alienating Tehran, especially considering the immense pressure Iran is under?
Well, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov is quoted in the text telling reporters that Russia had actually been offering mediation even before the conflict entered its military phase.
That's a fascinating timeline detail.
It is. He said proposals are still on the table, but he added a substantial caveat. Resolving the crisis would require multiple agreements and understandings between the parties involved.
Multiple agreements and understandings.
Right. He urged patience, noting that diplomatic channels continue to operate.
That phrase from Peskov is doing an extraordinary amount of diplomatic heavy lifting.
It really is. It's an explicit acknowledgement that this isn't a localized border dispute solvable with a simple bilateral ceasefire document.
He is signaling that any resolution must address a complex matrix of regional security architectures.
Exactly. But to answer your question about alienating Tehran, we have to look deeper into the structural incentives driving Russia's positioning.
Right, because there's always an economic angle.
And the source text gives us a critical data point here. It states that the conflict has driven global oil prices higher, and then explicitly notes something that could benefit Russia as a major energy exporter.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that economic reality profoundly complicates the facade of an impartial mediator.
It does.
Because if we pull that thread, the economic dynamic completely reframes the diplomatic outreach.
Yes.
If your state revenue relies heavily on exporting crude, and a regional war involving your strategic partner is causing the risk premium on that energy to skyrocket.
Where is the actual tangible incentive to force a rapid cessation of hostilities?
Exactly. Why would you rush to turn the money printer off?
Precisely. We need to look at the specific mechanics of Russian crude exports under current global conditions.
Right, because Russia operates under a web of Western economic sanctions.
Yes. To bypass this, they rely on a shadow fleet of tankers and complex financial routing. A prolonged Middle East conflict that threatens the Strait of Hormuz or major regional production facilities specifically helps them.
So the longer the instability continues without spiraling into a total unmanageable global meltdown, of course.
The higher the baseline price of crude.
Which directly funds the Kremlin's domestic and foreign policy objectives.
Exactly. So when Putin calls Trump to offer mediation, it must be viewed through that macroeconomic lens.
It's a dual-purpose move.
The mediation offer asserts Russia's relevance as an indispensable global architect, a power Washington must consult, while the ongoing low-to-medium-intensity chaos continuously optimizes their export revenues.
It's an intricate, highly cynical strategic calculus.
It is.
But that brings up a critical tension in the text regarding intelligence and operational security.
Yes, the intelligence sharing warnings.
The Times of India report mentions that Washington has raised severe concerns that Moscow could be actively sharing intelligence with Tehran.
Specifically, U.S. envoy Steve Witko urged Russia not to provide targeting data that could help Iranian forces strike American positions in the region.
This is where the concept of the active communication channels mentioned in the text becomes truly staggering to wrap our heads around.
The Kremlin declined to comment on the reports regarding targeting data.
Of course they did.
But they immediately confirmed that communication channels between Moscow and Washington remain active for the most sensitive issues.
That's a striking contradiction.
It really is.
You have the U.S. envoy actively warning a global rival to stop facilitating strikes against American assets, yet in the exact same diplomatic breath, they are maintaining active communication lines.
It seems impossible to balance.
How do diplomats and military commanders manage that level of cognitive dissonance in real time?
They manage it because it is the foundational requirement of modern asymmetrical superpower relations.
Elaborate on that.
What we are seeing is the evolution of Cold War-era deconfliction. Washington and Moscow can be locked in a proxy engagement, trading accusations of facilitating deadly strikes while simultaneously maintaining heavily encrypted secure lines.
To ensure a tactical miscalculation doesn't trigger a strategic nuclear-level catastrophe.
Exactly. When Peskov emphasizes that Russia tried to intervene before the kinetic phase began, it is a calculated attempt to wash Moscow's hands of the immediate violence.
They are positioning themselves as the responsible geopolitical adults in the room.
Establishing a narrative of diplomatic diligence, even as the U.S. suspects them of providing the telemetry for the strikes.
So, while Moscow plays this multi-layered game of strategic partner, reluctant mediator, and primary economic beneficiary, the view from Washington presents its own set of intense contradictions.
Yes, let's look at the text breakdown of the U.S. response.
The internal narrative friction is profound. President Trump confirmed the conversation with Putin.
He acknowledged that the Russian leader expressed a desire to be helpful.
But then Trump immediately countered by suggesting that Russia could do more by first ending its war in Ukraine.
That deflection is a textbook realpolitik maneuver.
Right. When a geopolitical rival offers you assistance or leverage in one theater, you immediately attempt to extract concessions in another.
Trump is actively refusing to let Putin compartmentalize the Middle East from Eastern Europe.
By explicitly linking the two, he is reminding the listener and the broader international community that you cannot cultivate the image of a benevolent peacemaker in the Gulf while executing a sustained military campaign in Ukraine.
It vividly illustrates the absolute interconnectedness of modern conflicts.
Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Nothing is isolated. A phone call ostensibly about Tehran instantly transforms into a high-stakes negotiation regarding Kyiv.
Let's examine Trump's public assessment of the war itself, because the linguistic choices outlined in the text are an extraordinary exercise in strategic communication.
The rhetoric here is very specific.
When reporters pressed him on whether the war would be over soon, specifically, if it would conclude in a matter of days, Trump categorized the entire multi-nation military conflict as an excursion.
An excursion.
He stated, I think soon, and added that with respect to very soon, the adversaries have lost everything.
He claimed that 2 levels of Iranian leadership, and potentially more, are gone.
Right. He further emphasized this by stating that most people have never even heard of the leaders they are talking about,
projecting an image of total, effortless dominance.
The utilization of the word excursion really demands careful analysis.
It does. Categorizing a high-stakes military confrontation involving ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and the direct involvement of global superpowers as an excursion is a highly deliberate psychological operation.
Because an excursion implies a brief, low-risk, easily managed deviation from the norm.
It projects absolute, unassailable dominance.
It is designed to aggressively diminish the adversary's operational capabilities and minimize the overall gravity of the geopolitical situation in the minds of the domestic electorate.
It's an attempt to rhetorically shrink the battlefield.
Exactly. He's framing it not as a protracted war, but as a brief tactical errand that is already largely completed.
And the specific claim that 2 levels of leadership are gone seems to serve a very specific dual purpose.
Let's break that down.
Militarily, asserting the decapitation of an enemy's command and control structure is the ultimate metric of a successful strike campaign.
Sure.
But psychologically, it's designed to fracture the morale of the adversary's remaining ranks, while simultaneously reassuring the domestic audience back home that victory is not just imminent, but has fundamentally already been achieved.
You don't need to worry about a long war if the enemy's architects are already eliminated.
Right. However, the source text immediately introduces a jarring contradiction to this narrative of a frictionless, imminent victory.
This is where the text reveals the internal friction in Washington.
Yes.
Right after detailing Trump's claims of an almost finished excursion, the report drops this crucial data point.
The Wall Street Journal report.
Yes, a report claiming that Trump's own advisors had explicitly urged the U.S. president to exit from the war.
This contrast is perhaps the most revealing element of the Washington dynamic.
It is. I mean, why would a president's inner circle actively urge a strategic exit from an excursion that is supposedly wrapping up in days with total decapitating victory?
Exactly. If the strategic objectives have been met and the enemy leadership is gone, you don't need your advisors maneuvering to find a diplomatic off-ramp.
The operation would simply conclude.
The fact that they are urging an exit implies they see a reality fundamentally disconnected from the public rhetoric.
This highlights the immense, dangerous gap between public bravado and internal strategic anxiety.
A leak of this nature to the Wall Street Journal is rarely accidental.
Right. At this level of statecraft, it is almost always an intentional maneuver by a specific internal faction.
It suggests there is a contingent within the national security apparatus that views the situation not as a brief, manageable excursion, but as an escalating quagmire with unacceptable risk vectors.
They are likely calculating the severe macroeconomic and strategic vulnerabilities that the public messaging is deliberately obscuring.
Attempting to shape reality through sheer rhetorical assertion while adversaries maintain the capacity to inflict kinetic or economic damage is a highly volatile strategy.
It is incredibly vulnerable to the friction of actual events on the ground.
It illustrates how the information war runs parallel to and often contradicts the physical war.
Trump's specific phrasing, that most people have never even heard about the leaders that they're talking about, is a further attempt to minimize the adversary's geopolitical weight.
It's a way of stating we eliminated them, and their irrelevance is proven by your ignorance of them.
But placing this extreme projection of confidence right next to the internal push for a rapid exit really forces you to question the data in the classified briefings versus the statements at the press podium.
Yes. And while Washington wrestles with its own internal narrative contradictions and Moscow plays its cynical double game with energy markets, it creates a massive vacuum on the world stage.
And looking at this text, it's clear exactly who is stepping in to fill it.
China.
That brings us to Beijing's maneuvers. The Times of India text details a highly calculated intervention by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi.
Yes.
He issued a call for an immediate ceasefire, stating bluntly that the war should never have happened and that violence benefits no one.
He urged all parties to return to diplomacy, insisting that negotiations and equal dialogue are the only viable path to prevent the flames of war from spreading across the region.
It is vital to analyze the underlying architecture of China's positioning here.
They are not merely issuing standard diplomatic platitudes calling for peace.
No, they are actively utilizing the crisis to position Beijing as a fundamental systemic alternative to Western hegemony.
The text explicitly notes that Wang Yi portrayed Beijing as a major pillar of stability in a world facing growing geopolitical turmoil.
This is a rigorous, long-term branding exercise aimed at the global south and non-aligned nations.
And looking at the text, Wang Yi uses highly specific, ideologically loaded language to build that brand.
Yes, the text notes that China asserts the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Iran, and all countries in the Gulf region must remain inviolable.
They state that Middle East affairs should be decided independently by the countries of the region.
But then Wang Yi explicitly calls out planning color revolutions and orchestrating regime change, stating that it is not popular.
That isn't just a call for stability. That's an ideological stake in the ground.
Isn't Beijing using this crisis to codify a new international legal framework?
You've hit on the core ideological clash embedded in this text.
Let's explore that.
The phrase color revolution is the most loaded geopolitical term in the entire report.
How so?
In the lexicon of nations like China and Russia, a color revolution refers to what they view as Western-engineered pro-democracy uprisings designed specifically to topple non-compliant, non-Western governments.
Think of the Rose Revolution in Georgia or the Orange Revolution in Ukraine.
Exactly. When Wang Yi explicitly condemns color revolutions and regime change in the context of this Middle East conflict, he is delivering a masterclass in diplomatic subtweeting.
He is indicting the United States without having to utter its name.
He is indirectly, but unmistakably, critiquing decades of Western foreign policy doctrine.
But it goes deeper than a critique, doesn't it?
Yes. This specific phrasing is an attempt to intellectually and legally elevate China's global security initiative.
The GSI.
Right. Beijing views the UN's traditional responsibility to protect doctrine, often championed by the West, as a Trojan horse for intervention and regime change.
So by stating that orchestrating regime change is not popular, Wang Yi is actively aligning China with the deep-seated historical grievances of nations across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America.
Nations who feel perpetually threatened by Western military or economic intervention.
It's a strategic juxtaposition.
Beijing is essentially broadcasting, we respect your absolute sovereignty and your borders. Washington wants to unilaterally overthrow your leadership structures.
The text quotes Wang Yi directly. He says, "The Middle East's history has repeatedly taught us that force is not the solution, and resorting to arms will only fuel new hatred and create new crisis."
He positions China as a genuine friend and a strategic partner to the nations of the Middle East,
offering to implement this global security initiative to restore order and lasting peace.
Contrast that philosophical, highly structured diplomatic framework with the kinetic reality described at the very beginning of the source text.
The missiles, the drones, the decapitation strikes.
China is executing a multi-generational strategy here.
While the U.S. and Israel are hyper-focused on tactical military dominance and immediate leadership decapitation,
and while Russia is maneuvering for short-term macroeconomic leverage via energy markets,
China is offering a completely different systemic paradigm. They want to be the indispensable mediator for the next century.
But looking at the broader economic realities, doesn't China have a massive vulnerability here?
You mean regarding oil?
Yes. If Russia benefits from high oil prices, China, as the world's largest net importer of crude, suffers immensely from a destabilized Middle East.
So how does their reliance on regional energy factor into this diplomatic push?
That is the structural paradox of China's position. They absolutely require a stable Middle East to ensure the continuous flow of hydrocarbons to fuel their manufacturing base.
Therefore, their call for a ceasefire is driven by acute domestic economic necessity, not just altruism.
Exactly. However, they are attempting to convert that economic vulnerability into diplomatic capital.
By advocating for fair and equal dialogue, they are trying to secure their energy supply chains while simultaneously eroding American influence in the region.
So synthesizing this balance of power, you have Trump asserting absolute unilateral dominance, an excursion that ends on Washington's timeline.
And you have China pushing for a multipolar framework built on equal dialogue and non-interference.
Those are two entirely irreconcilable visions of global order.
They are structurally incompatible.
China's ultimate objective, as revealed in the subtext of this report, is to utilize the friction and chaos generated by U.S. military actions to present Beijing to the rest of the world as the sole responsible adult capable of fostering genuine, non-coercive stability.
They are leveraging this specific crisis to accelerate the transition toward a multipolar world order where regional powers instinctively look to Beijing rather than Washington for conflict resolution and economic integration.
Which brings us to the absolute wild card in this entire geopolitical equation.
Yes, Iran.
We've dissected Russia's paradoxical profit-driven mediation.
We've examined Washington's internal friction and rhetorical dominance.
We've analyzed China's ideological play for global leadership.
But none of this high-level diplomatic maneuvering means anything if the actors actually absorbing and launching the strikes refuse to alter their behavior.
The text depiction of Iran's posture is staggering.
It truly is. The source material outlines an Iranian strategic posture that is utterly unyielding.
A stance that effectively paralyzes the diplomatic machinery of the other three superpowers involved.
According to the text, Iran's Foreign Minister Saeed Abbas Araghchi stated unequivocally to PBS News that negotiations with the United States were no longer on the agenda.
It is a complete shutdown of direct bilateral engagement.
But the text reveals something much more profound regarding Iran's relations with its own supposed allies.
Yes, the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson confirmed that Tehran had actively refused formal requests for a ceasefire from France, Russia, and China.
This is a remarkable revelation regarding the limits of superpower influence.
We just spent considerable time analyzing how Russia operates as Iran's crucial strategic partner.
And how China is aggressively styling itself as Iran's genuine friend and the new pillar of global stability.
Yet when these massive superpower allies approach Tehran and request a cessation of hostilities, Iran's response is an unambiguous flat refusal.
It takes an incredible amount of leverage, or perceived leverage, to say no to Beijing and Moscow when you are under severe military bombardment.
The spokesperson is quoted in the text addressing these requests.
Let me look at the exact phrasing. The text says, well, this is their request and we are fulfilling it. Wait, no, the cessation of this war is in the hands of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
The source text seems to have a slight rhetorical contradiction there, initially acknowledging the requests but immediately overriding them to state the decision rests entirely and solely with Tehran.
The overarching point the text makes crystal clear is their active refusal to implement the requested ceasefires.
What you're seeing there is the absolute assertion of sovereign control over the conflict's timeline.
Iran is flatly rejecting the traditional dynamic where a proxy or regional power eventually bows to the pressure of its superpower backers.
They are dictating the terms of engagement to the entire globe.
The spokesperson proceeds to lay out impossible conditions for a traditional ceasefire.
They state that a cessation happens only when they receive a guarantee that aggressive actions will not happen again.
And most crucially, that their adversaries must accept full responsibility for their own actions.
Demanding that the United States and Israel publicly accept full responsibility for the conflict in the middle of an active kinetic war is essentially a demand for unconditional geopolitical surrender.
It's an absolute non-starter, and Tehran's diplomatic corps certainly knows it's a non-starter.
Which leads to the critical analytical conclusion. They are not genuinely seeking a diplomatic off-ramp at this juncture.
And understanding why they are not looking for an off-ramp requires us to examine the most vital piece of macroeconomic data in the entire source text.
Iran claims they hold the upper hand.
But we must look meticulously at how they define and measure that upper hand.
This is where the transcript shifts from military strategy to global economics.
The spokesperson says, every single effort they have made has utterly failed. The Islamic Republic of Iran has inflicted severe and painful losses upon the Zionist regime, America, and their allies.
But notice what they don't say.
Right. They don't list destroyed military hardware, downed aircraft, or captured territory.
Instead, they pivot entirely and say, just observe the state of the global economy and energy. This is extremely painful for them.
This statement forces a reevaluation of the nature of modern geopolitical leverage.
It does. Iran has completely shifted the metric of victory away from traditional, purely military terms, where they are outmatched by U.S. and Israeli conventional forces.
And moved it into the realm of global macroeconomic stability.
They are explicitly weaponizing the structural pain felt in the global economy and energy sectors.
You don't need us to tell you that high oil prices hit your wallet.
No.
But what this source material reveals is a fundamental shift in macroeconomic warfare.
Iran isn't just trying to make your gas expensive.
They are calculating that the structural fragility of Western inflation, specifically in a post-pandemic economy dealing with complex yield curves and constrained central banks, is a more effective weapon than any ballistic missile.
They are essentially weaponizing our own monetary policy against us.
They are executing asymmetric warfare on a macroeconomic scale.
They understand that Western political leadership is hyper-vulnerable to inflation and economic stagnation.
By threatening the stability of the energy markets, they take the massive, incredibly complex global supply chain and turn it into a strategic hostage.
They're communicating to Washington. You might possess stealth bombers. You might claim you've successfully executed decapitation strikes against our leadership, but we possess the capacity to force the risk premium on oil to a level that destabilizes your domestic politics and fractures your economy.
And the Iranian spokesperson uses vivid, almost dismissive language to reject traditional diplomatic interventions.
They state, it's not like they'll just come today and say, stop and cease fire, and we'll say very well, and it's all over.
That quote perfectly encapsulates the total breakdown of the traditional diplomatic stopgaps the world has relied on for decades.
Superpowers can no longer simply snap their fingers, apply economic pressure, and freeze a regional conflict.
Because the regional power in question believes it is actively winning a macroeconomic war of attrition.
This exposes the massive, unbridgeable narrative gap the text has laid out.
Earlier, we analyzed Trump's claims that the war is a mere excursion, concluding in days, with Iran's leadership completely gone and adversaries having lost everything.
Now, the text shows the Iranian military aggressively slamming those claims,
stating that the adversaries' efforts have utterly failed, that Iran has delivered truly devastating blows to the global economy, and that Iran alone will determine the end of the war.
We have a scenario where both sides are observing the exact same theater of operations and simultaneously claiming absolute unqualified victory.
It's as if they are fighting in two completely separate parallel realities.
And that is the severe danger of information warfare running at maximum intensity alongside kinetic warfare.
When both sides successfully convince their domestic populations and internal power structures that they possess the decisive upper hand and that total victory is not only possible but imminent,
compromise becomes politically toxic and practically impossible.
If the U.S. administration admits the conflict is devolving into a protracted quagmire, it shatters their narrative of effortless dominance.
If Iran agrees to a ceasefire without extracting impossible concessions, like the U.S. taking full responsibility, it shatters their narrative of successfully bringing the West to its economic knees.
They are fundamentally trapped in the architecture of their own rhetoric.
Let's synthesize the vast amount of ground we've covered in your notes.
We've examined Russia's paradoxical, profit-driven, dual-track diplomacy.
We've dissected the intense friction between Washington's public assertions of dominance and internal anxieties.
We've analyzed China's highly calculated ideological pivot to establish a new, multipolar security framework.
And we've detailed Iran's defiant execution of macroeconomic warfare.
The gridlock presented in this text is profound.
We have a situation where the U.S. claims the kinetic phase is nearly over, minimizing the systemic threat.
Iran categorically refuses to halt operations until impossible diplomatic demands are met, confident they are winning a global economic war of attrition.
Russia actively plays both sides, maintaining its partnership with Iran, proposing mediation to the U.S., all while its state revenues are buoyed by the high oil prices generated by the chaos.
And China hovers above the immediate fray, utilizing the instability to systematically critique Western interventionist doctrine and position its own global security initiative as the sole legitimate alternative.
It is a perfect, self-sustaining storm of conflicting geopolitical interests where absolutely no actor has a clear strategic incentive to be the first to de-escalate.
The traditional levers of international power sanctions, UN resolutions, superpower pressure appear completely jammed.
Which leaves us with a stark realization about the trajectory of the modern world order.
The source material you provided outlines a scenario where global superpowers are deploying every tool in their diplomatic, informational, and military arsenals, yet entirely failing to impose a rapid resolution on a regional conflict.
And that brings us to the final thought we want to leave you with, drawn directly from the subtext of the Times of India report you asked us to analyze.
We saw that Russia and China, nations widely recognized as Iran's crucial strategic and economic partners, actively requested that Iran agreed to a ceasefire.
And Iran flatly refused.
They essentially ignored the requests of superpowers because they calculate that they hold the ultimate trump card.
The capacity to inflict severe structural energy disruption and macroeconomic pain.
The profound question this text forces us to consider is this. If a regional nation firmly believes it holds the ultimate leverage in the form of global macroeconomic disruption and is willing to absorb immense kinetic military strikes in order to utilize it,
do traditional diplomatic interventions by superpowers hold any real coercive power anymore?
Or have we fundamentally entered a new era where the capacity to inflict sustained structural economic pain outranks both conventional military superiority and historic superpower alliances?
It is a staggering question. But it is precisely the kind of systemic inquiry you have to engage in when you look past the disjointed headlines and rigorously analyze the source material.
Thank you for sending this report in and joining us on this deep dive. Decoding these complex narratives and understanding the macroeconomic and diplomatic architecture beneath them is the only way to truly grasp the forces reshaping our world. Keep analyzing the subtext, keep questioning the official rhetoric, and keep challenging the simplistic narratives. We'll be back soon to unpack the next dossier. Until then, keep digging.